the requirements of imperialism are now such that in order for the requirements to be fulfilled, imperialism has to stand nakedly as a tremendously oppressive, even murderous force before the rest of the world. And when that point comes, it's not possible to maintain the system. The atrocities visited upon the victim are now so obvious that soothing rhetoric has no place. Nobody will listen to it. Capitalism gives us what we want. No, it doesn't give us what we want. It tries to persuade us to want what it has.
You seem to be slotting every sort of answer into a grand tale of capitalism and what stage we're at, which I like.
I totally agree, by the way, and I think that's a great frame to give it. Thank you.
Yeah. No, that's why I wanted you on. This is the Dilemma Podcast. I'm Jay Shapiro, and these are some before thoughts I have on my conversation with Radhika Desai. Radhika is a fantastic author and commentator and thinker. She's frequently on the Geopolitical and Economic Report, which is a fantastic channel. And I want to mention her most recent book, Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, is available for a free download. I'll put the link in the description, thanks to the Knowledge Unlatched Foundation. So very cool, free book. Check it out. And so Radhika, I just want to introduce, Radhika is very much a Marxist thinker. And you'll hear even in sort of my first questions, when I sort of just am asking her, I think kind of innocently, to assess the world that we're in now, she hears that question and responds to it, I think, amazingly with really detailed encyclopedic knowledge as kind of a question of where are we in the story of Karl Marx's theory of capitalism's eventual collapse and eating itself. So she assesses the world through that lens and kind of always does and has. And I think it's incredibly valuable to just put that lens on the world. So Karl Marx, I'm not a Karl Marx scholar. I don't know him in and out. Us YouTubers who do this kind of intellectual stuff, we always have these bookshelves behind us, and we should probably take the books down and read them a little bit. So I have this one here, Capital by Karl Marx. This is a new translation. And just took it down off the shelf yesterday and read it all in one sitting over coffee. Just kidding. It's huge. And this is just volume 1. I think there's 3 volumes of this coming out. It's great. I've, of course, read pieces of it and parts of it. It needs a full study guide, I'm sure. But certainly Radhika has, and she's a Marxist scholar. So a couple words on Karl Marx, and this is just anecdotal. First anecdotal is that some of you may know I used to judge and coach from time to time for the High School Ethics Bowl. It's a philosophy sort of debate competition in America, which is really cool. The cases are really wonderful. I used to use them all the time for early dilemma episodes with these fun moral dilemmas. And just anecdotally, the students always had to sort of fill out this form for certain, like icebreaker, meet and greet stuff, where they would fill out their favorite philosopher. And Karl Marx was by far the most frequently listed name. I think there's probably a lot of interesting reasons for that, from sort of just a high school, I'm sure they haven't read the book, but a high school kind of maybe impression about the system that they're entering in capitalism, whatever. Maybe they're attracted to his ideas of alienation. But as just some basic Karl Marx theories of assessing capitalism as a specific type of commerce, right? Radhika and I like this part of the conversation where we distinguish capitalism as a distinct system. Some people just use it as a stand-in for commerce or greed generally, and it's not. It's a distinct system that grew out of Northwest Europe, and it had its own peculiarities. And Karl Marx, writing in the 1800s, was foreseeing and assessing, I think rather accurately assessing the internal contradictions within capitalism that would eventually lead to its demise for a variety of reasons. Now, we can argue about what happens next, and many people did. I talked about this in my anarchy episodes with Ruth Kina and Sophie Scott Brown, versus sort of anarchy versus communism. We could argue about that all day, but just his assessment of capitalism saw these contradictions, saw these problems, and laid them out. So what are just a few of those contradictions that he saw that I think would be good to keep in mind? Radhika will explain these better than I do, that Mr. Marx saw. I think the important ones to just notice here is that because of capitalism's tendency to accumulate excess capital, it would necessitate imperialism, which carries its own, in his view, financial contradictions to keep the systems going, but also, of course, moral contradictions because of what would happen there. I think that's probably the most important one to keep in mind. And then also that capitalism is at odds with democracy, true democracy, all the time, that the two actually don't mix, even though I think it's assumed, especially in America, oftentimes that these two things kind of jive and go together really well, and they do not. They are at odds. I think those are the two really important kind of contradictions within the system that Mr. Marx had in mind, and that he saw these stages, and I think some people are familiar with the evolution or devolution of capitalism and how it would go. And so that's how Radhika hears the questions and answers the questions, and there's so much in it. So we get into BRICS. I wish, honestly, we would get into a little bit more, but I do have a conversation lined up next with Patrick Bond that's going to be a little bit more focused on BRICS. And of course, we get into Gaza and what is unfolding there, the nightmare unfolding there, and what that means. And she will even answer that in terms of sort of the story of capitalism's internal contradictions being exposed, and maybe the hypocrisy of the rhetoric completely falling apart. So there you go. I really loved the conversation. It was really fun to find images and references to cover these things. I'll be back with some afterthoughts as well. There was a few times that I also just sort of paused and put a definition on the screen of a word that can get a little slippery, like postmodernism or something like that, that I think, I always need a reminder of kind of exactly what we're talking about there. So hopefully you appreciate those. There's a ton in here to go through and understand. And so enjoy Radhika Desai. The first conversation, or the first question, and I feel like I'm going to be asking this to a lot of my guests probably for the next year or more, is kind of a brief introduction to how you got involved in these questions of geopolitics and economics, but then also kind of your assessment now of the state of the world at the moment we're talking right now. Like how are you assessing or seeing or feeling what I think a lot of people are feeling out there, of maybe an earthquake under our feet, for better or worse? So introduce yourself, and then where are we?
No, I mean, it's such a funny thing. You should ask the question that you just did about how did I get into all this? Because and I don't think I've ever told this story anywhere, but if I were to really date my interest in questions of the world order and how it runs and whether it makes sense and so on, actually goes back to a conversation I had with my father over dinner when I was really in my early teens, I should say. I mean, for some reason, in fact, no, not for some reason, we were discussing the reason that what had just happened, which is the Soviets going into Afghanistan, and then one thing led to another. And my father referred to the Nixon's decision to delink the dollar from gold, and then we discussed that, and I thought, well, so then why does the world accept the dollar anymore? And he said, well, it's all a game, and I said, really, how can it all be just a game, etc. And so this conversation has remained in my mind, of course, in between that conversation and then my eventual writing of geopolitical economy. They're separated by a couple of decades, during which, of course, I got my 3 university degrees, during which I studied politics, but never dissociated from political economy and international political economy. And in the end, I ended up becoming so critical of what passes for the main theories in international political economy that I wrote Geopolitical Economy, which in the process of which I became even more dissatisfied with even more theories. So it became a much more comprehensive critique than I started out. So that's really me. I as I say, I study politics and political economy without separating them. So, for example, in my recent book, Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, I don't just analyze the decline of the West, the rise of China, and so on. And then the dollar system, etc. But I also give my own analysis of what is Trump about, what is happening to politics in Western countries, why is it happening, so right down to nitty-gritty of party politics and so on. So I look at it as a whole. So yeah, and what was the other question? Yes,
Well, yeah.
what
No, before we get to the other one, actually, was that conversation with your dad? Did you grow up in Canada or was that in
No, I
India?
grew up in India. I
In
did my
India.
first degree in India
Yeah.
in a city called Baroda, where there was, at the time I was going to, it was a fairly good university. I certainly think they prepared me quite well for my studies to come later. And then I went to study in Canada at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Where I was very lucky because I had a group of professors teaching me, all of whom, I mean, not all of them were Marxists, although one or two of them would have said they were, but they all took Marxism seriously, and they all understood that there was something like political economy and that you could not, understand the one without the other. And interestingly, they all they were not political scientists in that kind of very peculiar disciplinary manner. Although they used the work of political scientists, they all really thought about politics historically, which I think was another very lucky thing, because that is, to me, the natural way of thinking. That is the way in which classical political economists would have thought. That is how Marx thought. But from the late 19th century onwards, when we got neoclassical economics, and then a whole sort of social scientific division of labor was organized around it. So you had economics and sociology, and then politics, and then other of these disciplines. They not only divided up the study of society in these different disciplines and created artificial separations, which we now try to overcome by talking about interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity and blah, blah, and so on. But they also stopped us from thinking about society historically. And I feel that that's in many ways it's the bigger harm, which nobody even talks about. So I feel like, yeah. So in that sense, I was very lucky, and I suppose, yeah, and thinking in this way also makes natural sense to me. I've always been, anyway. There's so many stories to tell here, because one of the responses to the social sciences being ahistorical has been then to insert a kind of false historicity to the social sciences by talking about how everything goes in cycles. So cyclical thinking then has replaced historical thinking. But there is no substitute for proper historical thinking. And that's what I feel I try to do anyway. It's not easy, but I try to do it. Yeah.
I guess I was asking because I was wondering how your dad was so clued in.
My dad, it's funny. Yeah, he was a civil engineer. He always said to me that he regretted not becoming a lawyer, and that's what he wanted me to be. But on the way to doing a law degree, I just fell in love with studying the real world of politics and political economy and so on. But yeah, he was an MIT engineer, so he spent some time in the US as a student, and then he came back and built bridges, lots of other things. But I won't go into that. But he's always a very politically aware person.
Yeah, no, I think we underestimate our teenage years. I have a story I won't share now. It's on. People know it. When I went to Africa instead of Israel when I was 16, and it's my origin story for a lot of these questions. I think we all have them, and it's important to deliver them.
Yeah, fascinating.
But so the second question, and now we'll get into it, is it's a broad one, but sort of like the where are we now? Like, what is your assessment of the world now? We're 2 years after October 7th now, Trump in his second term. Like, how are you assessing the world? You brought up cyclical thinking and other kinds of thinking that maybe you're dissatisfied with. On the map of getting our bearings, what are you seeing out there right now? General assessment.
Well, okay, so I'm going to tell another little story because I think it's interesting. Many years ago, when I was a graduate student in the 1980s, one of my professors and I were discussing how postmodernism was all the rage. We were, although we criticized it, we still had to read, Lyotard and, whatever, Derrida and blah, blah, and so on. And it sounded, when you first encountered it, it sounded like amazing and so on. And then you soon began to realize that there's something deeply wrong with this. And so, I remember discussing this this scenario with my professor, and I said, at the end of it, I said, you know what, in about 10, 15 years max, we'll be talking about this as a very peculiar phase in the in intellectual history. I mean, right now it's as though we are in a circus with many tents, and we just happen to be in the middle of this tent. So we think that this is all that is going on, but soon we'll be out of this tent and into another tent, and then we'll realize that that was just one element of some very large thing. So I think similarly, I feel that, but on a much grander scale, of course, a sort of roughly 200-year history of Western dominance. And I would rather keep it at 200 years. I mean, some people may want to go back to Columbus, but I think that's like, maybe it was part of the run-up to it, but not directly part of it. But a 200-year history of Western dominance is ending.
Yeah.
And that Western dominance was built not on, the wars of the voyages of exploration like Magellan or Columbus or Vasco da Gama or what have you, although they, as I say, they were part of the run-up to it. They prepared the ground for it. But it really was based on the advent of industrial capitalism in the northwest corner of Europe, which then became very consequential for the rest of the world. I mean, not only did it create a system wherein a small capitalist class became rich by exploiting the labor of the vast majority of the people of that country, but it also created, at the international level, a system of imperialism, which essentially meant that not only were workers exploited by capitalists everywhere, but also that capitalist countries benefited from the exploitation of the rest of the world, and that they and also my argument is, and I do believe that this is in line with Marx's argument, is that you cannot have capitalism without accompanying imperialism, simply because capitalism is inherently contradictory. And in order to manage, and you need a state to manage the contradictions. And once you have a state to manage the contradictions, the state has at least two options to deal with the problems of contradictions of capitalism. One is, of course, through domestic actions of various sorts, whether it is repressing the working class or making concessions to the working class, but it is also by subordinating much of the rest of the world to create a sort of a cocoon within which capitalist countries can exist, which the cocoon provides for their needs. It does a number of things we can discuss later. But so essentially, and you had successful capitalist development in other countries outside Britain, which was the first industrial capitalist country, as long as there were other territories available for subordination. But once you got to the early 20th century, as Lenin pointed out, the world was divided up among the major capitalist powers. Those countries that managed to industrialize up to that point, they could do so by capitalist means. But what we've seen since then, with the beginning with the Russian Revolution, is we have seen that development that is reasonably successful, say in the Soviet Union back then, or in the PRC today, has had to be socialist, with barring exceptional, very highly exceptional countries like South Korea and Taiwan, which are first of all small, and second, as we know, they were the frontline states against communism. So they got a lot of special treatment from the United States in particular. So barring such small exceptions, you've not had successful capitalist development anywhere. So to me, and let me, sorry, I'll speak for 2 or 3 minutes more, but I think it's important that I get this bit in.
Yeah.
You see, Marx, people, unfortunately, a lot of Marxists themselves give you not a Marxist understanding of the world and of capitalism, but a Schumpeterian understanding in which capitalism is capable of infinite growth technological advance, innovation, etc. But this is actually not true. Certainly, that's not the Marxist understanding. Marx had said very clearly that once capitalism arrives at the monopoly stage, and it had to arrive at the monopoly stage because monopoly is the necessary outcome of the process of competition. Once you have all the less efficient companies compete, they essentially are pushed out of the market. There are only one or two or a handful left, and then you get monopoly capitalism. And he said, once you arrive at the monopoly phase, capitalism will have exhausted any further potential for being historically progressive. I mean, capitalism advanced the forces of production, no matter how brutally, anarchically, oppressively, exploitatively it did it, but it did that. But now it wouldn't even be able to do that. That's the idea. Capitalism would have lost its mojo, lost its productive dynamism. Now, that stage had already arrived in the early 20th century. And perhaps had to arrive because by that time, the capitalist countries that had developed, they were fine, they had developed, but there was no possibility for other capitalist countries, other countries to experience successful capitalist development because the world was divided up. There was no possibility of imperialism. If there's no possibility of imperialism, you can't have successful capitalist development. This was actually clear to lots of people. And remember that in the early 20th century, from 1914 to 1945, you got what the historian Arno Meyer called the 30 Years crisis. And it was a crisis of capitalism and imperialism, consisted of two great imperialist wars and a Great Depression and much else besides. And at the end of that, a lot of people, and not just Marxists, even people like Keynes or Karl Polanyi, believed that the world had to turn radically away from capitalism towards something else, towards something progressive, more progressive, because capitalism had just shown the world that it could cause these horrific imperialist wars in which industrialized killing took so many lives and so on. Plus, it had the Great Depression. So what was there to salvage? I mean, the world would have to turn left. And people like Hayek feared the same thing. So everybody thought that. But then the Second World War ended, and after a few years of depression, whatever you want to call it, recession, depression, the world experienced the so-called golden age of growth. And a lot of people point to that and say, look, capitalism revived itself. It shows that it is capable of infinite reinvention, advancement, etc., etc. Many people, including many Marxists, say, capitalism still has a long way to go. This shows that. But actually, the golden age growth was not because of capitalism. It was because of the fact that capitalism was heavily reformed by Keynesian welfare states. Plus, remember that the golden age of growth refers to world growth, not just growth in the capitalist countries. And remember that at that time, we had socialism across the vast swath of territories and populations had become socialist. As I like to say, from Prague to Pyongyang, you had socialism. And this, people forget that this communist bloc, or whatever you want to call it, accounted for a very large proportion of growth. You see, in fact, back in the 50s and 60s, people said, how come, they envied the socialist countries because unlike capitalism, which went through its ups and downs, cyclical downturns and so on, the socialist countries could keep growing consistently year after year after year, posting very, very healthy growth rates. And remember also that Russia had been brought from being a backward country into the second biggest industrial power in the world by the 1930s. And had this not been done, Hitler may well have won the war. This is also important to remember. So all of this is part of that scene. But anyway, the point is that people, so to me, it's that plus the developing countries, the newly independent countries were undertaking projects of autonomous national development. And in many countries, the period from about the 3 odd decades from the end of the Second World War were the best decades for development. Since then, most countries have not experienced, much development. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that a lot of people attributed this growth to capitalism. capital.
Yeah.
But then you got the stagnationist crisis of the 1970s. And then, there were two possibilities. We could have said, well, let's deepen these socialistic reforms and then we will continue the growth. And the other people said, no, it's these socialistic reforms that are the problem. We have to remove them. We have to free capital from the shackles of these reforms. And then capitalism will, its productive dynamism will be restored and everything will be fine. Well, we are now 4.5 decades down that road. It has never worked. Capitalism's productive dynamism has never been restored by neoliberal policies. This is what we call them, neoliberal policies, the second option. Nevertheless, the ruling elites of Western countries have stuck to the rather than giving up on neoliberalism, they have simply modified it slightly, a bit this way and a bit that way now and then. But essentially, they have stuck to the program of giving more and more freedom to capital, which in our time means giving more and more freedom to big capital, to big monopoly capital. And what happens when you give more and more freedom to big, a senile monopoly capitalism is you don't get the restoration of productive dynamism. Instead, you get low growth, low investment, financialization, and increased inequality, where you create an economy of what many people, I think very rightly, call takers and not makers. So that's what we've got. So so essentially, to come back to the main question you asked, what time in the history of capitalism are we at? We are at the, as I say, the argument I'm constructing is that we are we are at the end really of the phase of the dominance of capitalism in the world and its accompanying imperialism. And this is happening because on the one hand, neoliberal Western capitalist countries led by the United States and the UK are declining visibly. They are losing productive capacities. They are not even at the forefront technologically, etc. Meanwhile, although the Soviet Union committed suicide, essentially, which is very sad and ill-judged and bad, but nevertheless, that's what happened. The People's Republic of China, the second most important communist power to ever exist, survived, and it is showing the rest of the world what a rationally planned economy can do, particularly when the ruling apparatus, namely the party state, is capable of learning from its mistakes, which I think this is what perhaps is the most valuable thing about the PRC and its ruling apparatus. So to me, sort of what time in history is it now? It is the point at which capitalism is dying. Although, unfortunately, still too many people put too much store by it. Certainly the elites of Western countries are committed to keeping it alive. And the elites of many third world countries, many of the rest of the world countries are still too invested in it. So they will do everything in their power to continue its existence. But this will be a failing effort, which means that no matter how much you resist it, you will not be able to recreate a productive, dynamic, legitimate form of capitalism, not even with the minimal legitimacy it had back when it was the reformed capitalism of the post-war era.
Wow, that was a lot. that's
it's a long answer.
No, it was great. I'm going to go back to pieces of it and have you pick it apart. Maybe this is a stupid and a basic one, but I do want to know even what capitalism is in your view, because a lot of people, and I tend to agree, that capitalism demands exploitation, or you're calling it imperialism. Can you just spell that out for the listeners of exactly what it is? Because money has always existed. Everyone says they hate capitalism, or what, a lot of people say this, and capitalism is a specific system of money production and usage, printing money, whatever. Explain to me what that shift is of what capitalism and why it does demand imperialism in that view.
Sure. I would love that. And I'm going to do that. And later on, I'll send you a figure which you can insert if you want this video. Okay, so what is capitalism? So first of all, you're absolutely right. And by the way, you just made a point with which many economists, including many Marxist economists, are not able to grasp. Money was not invented by capitalism.
Right.
Money pre-existed capitalism. Money is an ancient social technology. It's
Yeah.
a bit like language, we've had it for a long time. Like, capitalism may take language and subvert it for its own purposes, inventing phrases like there's no such thing as a free lunch. I mean, come on, if there were no such thing as a free lunch, we wouldn't exist. Our mothers give us free lunches for years before we get anywhere close to being able to take care of her. So, I mean, this is all complete nonsense. But nevertheless, capitalism distorts human society. But anyway, so capitalism takes the money system as a given, but it needs the money system. Why does it need the money system? Because capitalism, unlike every other form of a social organization known to human beings, does not produce the things we need. It does not produce, books or cups or jugs or hospitals or schools. It aims to produce something called value. Value. That's what it wants to produce. And everything that gets produced, the things of utility that we need every day, the food, the housing, the clothing, etc., is supposed to be a byproduct of the pursuit of the production of value. Now, what is value? Value is the distillation of socially necessary human labor. So what socially necessary labor is and what value is implicitly, even though you puzzle over it explicitly. Imagine that you went to the supermarket tomorrow and it said tomatoes, $40 a pound. And you say, what? They're not worth that much. Right? What do you mean when you say they're not worth that much? You are expressing your understanding, no matter that you have never articulated it, but somewhere in your mind is an understanding that given today's technological conditions, given today's norms about how hard people should work, given today's fertility situation, blah, blah, etc., like soil fertility and so on, tomatoes should not cost much more than, 50 cents a pound to produce. And okay, whatever, you transport it to the supermarket, etc. But even at the supermarket, they ought not to cost much more than, 90 cents for a pound, whatever. So you know this. And that's why you're able to say something like, what, they're not worth that much. So that's value, because essentially value is the amount of human labor embodied in tomatoes. So tomatoes embody, at the point at which you find them in the supermarket, 90 cents worth of human labor. Okay. And that also depends on today's going wage rate. But anyway, and all value is produced by human labor. It is not produced by machines. It is not produced by the land. It is not produced by air. No matter, gold does not have value because it is rare. What we mean when we say it is rare is that it takes a lot of labor to produce 1 ounce of gold, because it's hard to find. Finding it is part of the labor. Right? So the point is that workers are employed by capitalists. Workers produce more than what they are paid, not because they are being paid wrongly, but because, workers, my value, imagine if I'm a worker and the value of my labor is $10 a day, I go to the factory, and even though my employer may pay me $10 a day, the fact is that he or she employs me because I am capable of producing goods or services worth more than $10 in the day that I'm employed. And the very purpose of your management, if you're my employer, is to make sure that I produce that excess. And that excess is appropriated by my employer, and that is surplus value.
Yeah.
But at the same time, to me, the production of value and the appropriation of value in capitalism, which is the goal of capitalism, has two axes. One is the vertical one, where the capitalist extracts value from the worker. And then there's a horizontal one, consists of competition among capitalist firms. So imagine that we're all tomato farmers in the Thames Valley, and we all compete to produce tomatoes. And what will happen is that the process of competition will ensure that prices will be kept down to their socially necessary level. Like they compete. So it's imagine that we are both tomato producers, and I may invest in some new technology that reduces my costs to instead of say 50 cents a pound, my costs are now 40 cents a pound. So then I will be able, I will produce at 40 cents a pound, but of course I will not sell them at 40 cents a pound. If you are selling them at 50 cents a pound, I will sell them at 49 cents a pound and take away your market.
Yeah.
But eventually, either you will wise up and say, I also need to invest in this technology, and others will do the same. And then the price of tomatoes more generally will settle down at 40 cents a pound. So this is the process. So this process of competition presses prices down to their values. And so capitalism has had capitalism takes this technology, which is inherited, but it has a constant battle to try to manage money, try to make the political authorities, and there is no non-political money, try to ensure that the political authorities manage money in a way that they express value stably, that long bouts of inflation or deflation do not occur, etc. And this is an uphill battle at any time. We can discuss that another time. But so now, the point about all this is that we don't need to make beds or trucks or houses or fertilizer or tomatoes. The pursuit of value production will somehow ensure that all this is produced. Of course, it usually doesn't, but that's another matter. And of course, as you know, we are always told that left to itself, capitalism gives us what we want. No, it doesn't give us what we want. It tries to persuade us to want what it has. Yeah. Okay. So now, why does all this need imperialism? So basically,
Right.
within capitalism, because workers are not paid the full value of what they produce, even though they may be paid the fair value of their wage, they are not. Their wage does not encompass the full value of that's produced. So that's appropriated by the capitalist. Now the worker, whatever he gets or she gets, can be relied on to spend all their earnings, because they need more than what they can buy with their wage anyway. So they'll certainly spend their wage. But the capitalist who has appropriated a goodly part, say, maybe the workers got 60%, but the capitalist still kept 40% of the value that was produced. Well, even if the capitalist were an extremely how can you say, engaged in conspicuous consumption, lived an ostentatious lifestyle and so on, and even invested a great bit of it. But there is never any guarantee that the other 40% will be spent or will be spent in full. So that already gives you the most fundamental reason for crisis, which is that it is not possible for there to be demand for all that is produced. Demand is always a constraint. And then eventually, provided that this constraint is periodically overcome by various means, and imperialism will come into this in a second, capitalism also produces excess capital, because if you keep capital going, capitalist accumulation going, but demand conditions don't improve, capitalists will be left holding profits or excess capital, a return on capital, which they have no opportunity to invest, because even any sensible person would be dumb if they invested when demand conditions are bad. If you can't expect to sell what you're proposing to produce, why produce it? So they also end up having excess capital. And then, so those are two things. So you need outlets to accept this excess capital and excess commodities that capitalism is producing. And then on the other side, at the same time, if there is not to be inflation, capital needs to have the supply of labor and the supply of inputs to be relatively inexpensive. Right? I'm putting it in very overly simplified terms, but they need to have cheap inputs and cheap labor. And so on the one hand, you need a subordinated periphery to accept your excess goods and your excess capital, even if it means the destruction of those economies. On the other hand, you need cheap inputs, cheap labor, right? So, and by the way, there is a contradiction between these two sets of needs. On the one hand, the idea that the subordinated periphery of capitalism, the imperialized part of the world, should serve as outlets of commodities and capital means that they should be sufficiently prosperous and stable to be able to buy these. But on the other hand, if it is to yield up its raw materials and its labor cheaply, it has to be sufficiently impoverished to have to do that. So this contradiction has never been resolved. Like I can stop here if you want, but this is why capitalism needs imperialism, and this contradiction is not resolved. And there's a further contradiction, which is that, of course, countries that are threatened with or are actually subordinate, the leaderships of those countries can see very easily that they will soon become subject. To become reduced to the hewers of wood and drawers of water for the big capitalist countries. So they will resist it. And they will resist this by sponsoring capitalist development at home on their own. Who were the first thinkers to realize this? None other than Alexander Hamilton of the United States and Friedrich List of Germany, who learned a lot from Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton said, we are not going to become agricultural appendages of the UK. We are going to industrialize on our own, and we are going to do so by having protectionist walls in which cheap British goods cannot arrive, so that we may nurture our own industries and enable them to become internationally competitive, etc. And similarly, Germany and Japan had its own thinkers. And that, by the way, is the only way you can have capitalist development. Yeah. And we know that. So this resistance to imperialism, which was capitalist as long as these countries could have colonies, and after 1914 it has had to be socialist. This kind of anti-imperialist development in opposition to imperialism is the only way in which productive capacity has spread around the world. And so this is the other contradiction, which plays itself out, and it has led to today's multipolarity, and this has led to today's decline of capitalism, because of monopoly capitalism stage being reached was internal, but also externally as countries begin to develop. Other countries begin to develop, the options of the imperial powers narrow.
Sort of a question I have for you of because you mentioned multipolarity. I wonder if you think we're already there, or if we're still in sort of a decline of a unipolar moment of the United States. Because I want to talk about the United States as the empire post World War II, if that makes sense, and if you think it's best characterized as a military empire, a political or ideological empire, or an economic one, or some combination of all of them. Because I want to talk about sort of dollar dominance, how we got to this, back to your dad mentioning the Nixon shock. And, but I want to bring it up to now. And this is all great because I want people to understand the mechanics of how this stuff really works, how dollar dominance has come to run the empire. Because in some ways, before you even answer, like, I think some Marxist thinkers or some people hear these kind of leftist, anti-capitalist conversations, and they think we're just sort of, throwing peanuts at the rich guys from the back of the gallery out of some sort of jealousy, or thinking that there's some like mustache twirling evil men sitting where plotting to take over the world. But I want people to understand, and this is in line with a lot of the conversations I'm going to have soon, of if you understand the incentives of this machine, you've just laid out sort of a big picture of it, and maybe that it necessitates for better or worse, and obviously I think you and I would agree for worse morally, it necessitates a kind of exploitation or domination, or even, as a specific example I've been using a lot lately, I think since Iran is back on the news, a lot of Americans maybe for the first time are discovering, oh, they had a democratically elected leader who was certainly not an Islamist or a religious nut job or whatever, and his name was Mossadegh, and all he wanted to do is exactly what you just said, was try to develop within their own country, with their own resources, with their own currency. And who was it that unplugged that with a violent military coup? The West, this supposedly capitalist, democratic. So I think these contradictions that you're showing are showing up for people. So how did we get here? Dollar dominance, and then, what are the mechanisms that incentivize something like unplugging democracy and capitalism in a place like post-World War II Africa, or Latin America, or Iran? How does this work? How does the dollar work to be the lever, if that's right?
Sure. And you asked actually, so I give very long answers because you asked so many questions, so I have to give answers to. But let me just begin by saying very briefly that it is part of the ideology of Western countries. And by ideology, I don't just mean an erroneous view, but an erroneous view that serves their purposes, right? It is erroneous, but they keep repeating it because it serves their purposes. And that ideology is that somehow capitalism and democracy are closely tied together.
Right.
You're like like love and marriage and horse and carriage, they go together. This is complete nonsense. What capitalism has required historically, particularly in its competitive phase, where there is a large number of capitalists, is that they need to have a representative system, a liberal system, which is a representative system. So they need a liberal representative political system to function. I mean, liberal meaning that there has to be a system that preserves the freedoms of, particularly of property, and then associated freedoms thereof, and then the capitalists should be able to appoint their representatives to a parlement, a talking shop in French, where they will all broker their interests, right? So that is necessary, but there is absolutely no need for the ordinary working people to have the vote. This vote was fought for and won from elites who thought that this was a positively bad thing. You can't give the mob the vote. That was how it was conceived. And interestingly, the overwhelming majority of countries became meaningfully capitalist really only in the post-Second World War period. Before that, while, maybe Australia or New Zealand had been may have been democratic in the sense of having at least universal male franchise of a certain type, maybe with relatively few property qualifications, I don't know. But Europe, the moment it got serious mass franchise, that is mass franchise of elections to parliament that had teeth, which, you had something approximating mass franchise in Germany, for example, before 1914, but the parliament didn't have teeth. So it didn't matter. But once you got Weimar, when you had a parliament which was actually the authority, and you got mass franchise, you more or less immediately got fascism. So, and then it took a war to defeat that, and then you got, etc. So the point is that, and the United States can't be said to have become democratic until the 1970s, when the Jim Crow laws were repealed. And it's no wonder, therefore, that more or less as soon as the US becomes democratic, you begin to see vast deteriorations in the quality of democracy with attempts to disenfranchise the black population, critics, blah, blah, etc. So anyway, I have to throw that in because it is such a wrong assumption. But let me then now go back to multipolarity. So according to my arguments, which I've made in geopolitical economy, as well as in capitalism, coronavirus and war, and many other places besides, is that the world had already become multipolar in the late 19th century. Once you see, essentially, you had a situation in which Britain was like the major industrial power which ruled the roost. It had also the, helped not a small degree by the fact that it also had a very large territorial empire, the great British Empire on which the sun never set, the greatest empire in territorial extent and in demographic extent known to humankind. Fine. But the moment in the late 19th century when Germany, the United States, and Japan successfully industrialized, the world had already become multipolar. Okay, and so what we are, and then in the course of the 30 years crisis, which I like to say was bookended on either side by a major communist revolution, the Russian Revolution at the beginning, the Chinese Revolution at the end. So it really testified to the fact that a major turning point in the history of capitalism had already been reached back then. And then, with the recovery of Japan, Germany, etc., Western Europe, Japan, etc., the continuing development of the communist countries and so on, in those days we used to talk about bipolarity, which is also fine, but in the kind of sense we mean it was already multipolar, and it was getting more so, because the more productive capacity is spread around the world, the easier it is for other countries to, or on this count anyway, it should be easier for other countries to also develop. So the world has, and so that's the story about multipolarity. Now there's the story of US hegemony. So my argument is that, you may have heard many people say that the US is hegemonic. You may have heard many other people say that the US was once hegemonic, but it is declining. But I bet you've never heard anyone say that the US was never hegemonic. And the reason I say is that, the United States, let me rephrase that. Hegemony stability theory, the set of theories that are supposed to theorize US hegemony, you think that they are just normal social scientific theories, the best, most economical explanations there are of a certain given state of affairs. That was absolutely not true. Essentially what HST is, and you can show it by the provenance of this theory, which thinkers does it originate amongst and so on. But essentially it is a discourse that gives theoretical dress to what is nothing more than the desire of American elites to replace Britain, to have America replace Britain as the way they put it in one history that I've been reading, Carl Parini, the managing segment of the world economy. So this is what they were supposed to do. And already they could see that there was no way they could emulate Britain, truly emulate Britain, because there was no way in a world that was already divided up. And Lenin said that, from the early 20th century onwards, there could no longer be any further division of the world. The world was divided up. There could only be redivision. And redivision inevitably meant war against powerful enemies. The US was not up to that. And so they essentially decided that we are not going to try to get an empire of the size of the UK. We're going to settle for making the dollar the world's money. Just as sterling was kind of the world money. It never truly was. There were always competitors, but that's what the US wanted. The trouble was that sterling was only the world's money, or something approximating it, because it was an imperial currency, because of the British Empire, because Britain could extract surpluses from her non-settler colonies, chiefly British India, but also the Caribbean, Africa, etc., and export it as capital to her settler colonies and her former settler colony of the United States. So that's, and to Europe. So that's why continental Europe, North America, Canada, US, the Antipodes, Australia and New Zealand, all industrialized in the late 19th century, because the functioning of the sterling system extracted capital from British India and elsewhere and poured it out as capital exports to the rest of the world, which is why I often say, people say without really thinking about it, that, Keynes's book, John Maynard Keynes's book, Indian Currency and Finance, is the best primer on the workings of the gold standard. Now, why would a book on Indian currency and finance be a primer on the gold standard? Because British India was the linchpin. Without British India, there would have been no gold standard, right? And it was all the mechanics of essentially transferring the surpluses from British India. And remember, British India at that time was not just today's India, but it included Pakistan, Bangladesh, for a while Burma, and other territories besides. So anyway, all I'm saying is that that's why it was called the jewel in the crown. Anyway, point of all this is to say that dollar dominance could never work. So now we are coming to the dollar story that you want to tell. So essentially, in the immediate post-Second World War period, the dollar is not really serving as the world's money simply because there's a dollar shortage. The US is also the biggest exporter of goods. So that everybody is having to pay dollars to the US, they have no dollars left over. And nor has the US any capacity to export capital. Where is it going to get this capital from? It is having a hard enough time trying to ensure that its economy retains its relative size vis-a-vis the rest of the world, much of which is rapidly developing or reindustrializing or what have you, recovering. And then as soon as European currencies became convertible and they could use them in their mutual exchanges with one another, the dollar shortage turned overnight into a dollar glut. Nobody wanted dollars anymore. And at that time, in the late 1950s, Robert Triffin, the economist, explained to Congress, and then later on in a book, essentially putting forward his so-called Triffin dilemma, that if you provide the world with liquidity, with money, by running deficits, as the United States was doing, there's a big problem. It's a contradictory proposition, because the bigger your deficits, the more the downward pressure on your money, the less attractive your dollar becomes. So indeed, it was so, and the U.S., which had become home to a vast hoard of dollars, soon became bereft. Of gold, soon became bereft of gold, because the Europeans and others said, "Keep your valueless dollars, give us gold instead." And so they drained gold out by 19. And throughout that story of the 60s is the exhaustion of every expedient to try to maintain the dollar's gold link. And one after another, every last expedient having been exhausted, in 1971, this link was broken. And my argument has been that since that time, what looks like continuous dollar dominance is actually the engineering of a series of what I call financializations or expansions of purely financial activity. Initially by lending to the third world, then by Japanese lending to the US, then there was a long lull and the dollar fell into a bit of a what's the word for it? Anyway, it was very low. And then you got the dot-com bubble and the housing and credit bubble, and now we have the everything bubble. So these vast expansions of financial activity, they invite money into the dollar system. And that provides updraft to the downdraft of the US's deficits. But this now has also reached a huge turning point, a critical conjuncture rather, because the return of inflation does not permit the engineering of these asset bubbles, because they relied on easy money. Now, you can't have a regime of easy money anymore if you are going to combat inflation. And the only way in which capitalist central bankers will combat inflation, which is by raising interest rates and tightening monetary conditions. Easy money is not possible. So either there will be a big crash because the Fed is increasing interest rates, which is what happened in 2008, or if the Fed learns to tolerate inflation, which is what Trump is wanting to do, and practically, a lot of other people are also wanting the Fed to do, then the dollar's value will be eaten away by inflation. So one way or the other, it's not in a very happy situation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, your analysis on everything is like geopolitical, really, with these big, grand, structural, and I like it. And you seem to be slotting every sort of answer into a grand tale of capitalism and what stage we're at, which I which I
Which is,
like.
I totally agree, by the way. And I think that's a great frame to give it. Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, no, that and that's why I wanted you on. Of this, it's just like very zoomed out. That this all kind of is like a monster that is going to eat itself, and you're just sort of assessing everything that I'm throwing at you as symptoms of something that was predicted maybe by Marx and others a long time ago. And so that's where we're at. I guess I want to get to BRICS, and I want to get to Gaza and how you sort of see that as changing the system. But let's first get to BRICS and this what this means, what BRICS is, and what this means. I'm talking to Patrick Bond actually tomorrow, who also is very interested in BRICS, but I think, if I'm getting it right, has a much more pessimistic tone than you about this potential turning point or piece of the puzzle we're at. But first, and I think we're talking today, I think it was a week or two ago, when we reached this turning point that I think 51% of Earthlings now belong in BRICS countries. I think it was the day that Vietnam joined, it like hit that tipping point.
Yeah.
So maybe for future historians, this was a quiet piece of news in a very news cycle that actually might be huge one day. So what's BRICS? Are you optimistic that this represents something new? Where does this fit in the sort of story as you're telling of capitalism burning out its own fumes in maybe a violent manner?
Yeah, I mean, so to me, I've written on and off about BRICS, and there's one article of mine which keeps being cited. I think it's like it came out in the Guardian, and it's entitled something like "BRICS are building a resistance to Western hegemony" or
Right.
something. Forget
Did you write
exactly.
that headline? Sometimes you don't get to write the headline. Yeah,
I'm
see.
not sure actually. I
Yeah.
can't remember, but
Okay.
yeah, they changed that. But that was fine by me.
Okay.
Because you see, you have to realize that was written like in 2013 or thereabouts. And you see, so at that time, as you know, the term BRICS was coined by Jim O'Neill of Goldman Sachs, I think in 2000 or 2001. The acronym was basically saying that the center of gravity of the world economy is moving away from the West for the first time in 200 years. Not very far from what I am saying, although, of course, he looks at it from the point of view of investment opportunities and not from, as I do, from a political point of view.
And I just, before you even go on, I just want to, like, in concrete terms, is that as simple as like, if you're, I don't know why Zimbabwe keeps coming to mind. If you're Zimbabwe and you want to build a bridge or you want to do a project or whatever, it used to just be there's one guy in town to go ask for the loan if you couldn't raise whatever the funds or, and now there's more. There's, it's not
Well,
just the IMF. Yeah.
it didn't always used to be like that. Back in the day, if you wanted to build a bridge or a dam or whatever, let's say a dam,
Yeah.
the Nasser, for example, Jamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, first approached the Americans saying, "Will you help me build this critically important project for my country?" And the Americans and the World Bank essentially hiddered and dithered and so on. And then eventually, Nasser went to the Soviet Union. So remember that just as China is playing this role today, the Soviet Union did play such a role before. Of course, the situation is considerably different now, but nevertheless, that was so back then. And remember, the Soviet Union was much more isolated from the system. There was not such a big trading relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States as there is today between the United States and China. But anyway, but yes, and certainly there was a time, like for about a brief period, maybe in the 70s and into the the 90s and the 2000s, when there was only one guy, in the sense that there was only the West, essentially. Because you had the so-called unipolar moment. And I say so-called because, of course, it wasn't really necessarily that unipolar. And even if it was, it didn't last very long, because within 2 decades, less than 2 decades, we started talking about multipolarity. And the Americans were already afraid of that prospect within a decade. So essentially, you see, I feel that, I think that 1914 was the high point of imperialism. Since then, imperialism has been on a decline. It has been very slow. It has been very long. It has not been as sharp as I would like it to be, but it has nevertheless been on the decline. In the 1980s and 1990s, under the impact of the Volcker shock, the third world debt crisis that followed, and the structural adjustment imposed by the IMF and the World Bank on dozens upon dozens of third world countries, it looked as though imperialism was resurgent, that it was back in the game, and that this imperial power would last forever. But that moment also did not last very long. By the early 20th century, 21st century, you already have George Bush Jr. imposing steel and aluminium tariffs on China. The reason why the United States had engaged so much with China before that is simply because they thought that China would remain a low-value producer of cheap toys and shoes and clothes, and keep inflation low in the United States, by supplying these things so cheaply and so on. And even they didn't realize at that time in the 1990s, for example, that China had absolutely no intention of remaining there, and that it was going to do everything in its power to improve its technological and productive capacities. And it did so, rolled up its sleeves, and has continued doing so all of this time. So you had George Bush Jr. imposing tariffs, then you had Obama declaring the pivot to Asia, then you got Trump both fighting with and then doing deals with China, Biden even more intensively adhering to that anti-China policy, and now we have Trump back again. So it's been a long process. But in this long story, Jim O'Neill coined the term BRICS back in 2000 to indicate what should have been clear to lots of people, but perhaps was not. That's why his paper made a big splash, saying that these countries like this, particularly, and he chose 4 of the biggest countries in the non-Western world. And he said, look, 2 of these countries are resource rich, Russia and Brazil. And 2 of these are human resource rich, namely they are very populous economies, India and China. And that these guys, they are going to take they are going to now be soon in terms of of economic gravity, that they are going to account for more of world production than the Western countries combined. And that has indeed come to pass. Now, you have to understand, of course, that these are, as a population, in terms of population, this is a very big chunk of the world. And I remember, when I was going to school, being told, I haven't verified it, but being told that the GDP of India, not per capita GDP, total GDP of India. India is a vast country. At that time, it would have had some 300 million people in it. Was lower than that of Belgium, which had less than 10 million people in it. This is where things were at. So at some point, it was inevitable that the rest of the world would take over. But the question was, would they take over also in terms of technological capacities and so on? And the fact that they would take over would also have geopolitical consequences. So Jim O'Neill was only pointing to and remember what I've said, which is that you can't have development unless you engage in protectionist state-directed development. Obviously, China has done it much more successfully than any other country that is around today. But other countries are all going to have to follow suit. So at that time, when I wrote that piece, I was very careful to say that these countries are doing well, in good part because they have not accepted neoliberalism, either because in the case of China, they have never been neoliberal, or in the case of Brazil and Russia, they were, once badly burned, they are having a reaction to it, or in the case of India, they have always applied it in a modified way. Of course, since then, things have become much more complicated. Precisely because under Bolsonaro and Modi, Brazil and India in particular moved away from, moved back to neoliberalism in a certain sense, and and both leaders did great damage to their respective economies. And now Lula is back in power, but we are not sure the extent to which he is able to challenge the power of the big capitalists in Brazil who will retain their bias towards neoliberal policies, simply because neoliberal policies are policies that favor big capital. Same in India. India is running a roughshod over the interest not only of working people, but even of small and even some quite large businesses. Everybody below a small number of the really, really big corporations are getting shafted in the country. So don't believe the statistics about Indian growth, etc. They are all deeply problematic. But somehow they keep being trotted out because it serves the West to portray India as a kind of counterweight to China. Although now Trump is sinking that possibility, but that's Trump's problem, not mine. Russia, interestingly, is to a substantial extent able to control its capitalists simply because it got rid of the very pro-Western capitalists a long time ago, right? The big oligarchs are gone. Now you have sort of essentially oligarchs that are willing within, it's still, I would say, Russia is still more neoliberal than it should be, but the exigencies of war, etc., are essentially forcing it to be a much more developmental and a much more egalitarian economy, because you can't run a war without having broad-based legitimacy. So that is forcing Russia in a different direction. But certainly India and Brazil are in not a very good situation, especially India. So this is going to complicate matters. And what Trump has done most recently, which is to completely slap these tariffs on India and so on, and threaten secondary tariffs and so on, secondary sanctions. This is going to, of course, complicate, queer the pitch, shall we say, for Modi quite a lot, because Modi would like nothing more than to run into the embrace of the United States, even though India relies on Russian oil. And his dear corporate cronies rely on importing Russian oil to make big bucks. But he would still would have loved to do this, but at least for now, Trump's recent actions are putting, they're closing off this possibility. So the situation in the BRICS is very complex. So to me, you will not get growth. And I think that, in a country like India, even if you don't have an organized opposition, you have to produce some growth in order to maintain some minimal of legitimacy. Remember, in the last election, Modi lost his majority. Anyway, so I think that these imperatives of creating growth are bound to push most of the world away from the West and the US, whose offer is getting thinner and thinner anyway. Every so often you hear some story about the US, whatever Secretary of State has gone to some or the other country and offered them a few $1,000,000, largely to use as the US asks them to. Meanwhile, a few days later, some high-level Chinese official will go there and make it, promise money that is worth billions, promise projects that are worth billions. So this is, the US stands no chance. The West stands no chance. It doesn't have anything to give anymore. It is not a very attractive, it doesn't cut a very attractive figure internationally. Its legitimacy is low, particularly over Gaza. I mean, the whole world is watching Gaza, and the West is squandering what little moral authority it had. And so I think that both, and this matters, it's not that, somehow feelings or a sense of justice and injustice don't matter. In realpolitik, if you're really being real about realpolitik, that deep senses of injustice matter a great deal.
Yeah. Well, I want to stick with Gaza there, if we can maybe end on that, because you said a bit of it there, but I was trying to tease out your answer there. Is sort of the deal or the offer, like you said, of the West in these sort of economic terms has always been sort of coded in sort of a moral authority of like, well, work with us, we're the good guys because we love freedom and democracy. Like that China money or that Russia money is dirty money because they just love fascism and all this kind of other stuff. Is that, in your view, sort of the Gaza moment has revealed the hypocrisy? I mean, maybe the hypocrisies of the rhetoric, the Joe Biden rhetoric of, good against evil and light against darkness is just crumbling. Is that the way you see it? And then,
yes. I'm sad. I'm sad that we have to witness loss of life of the scale. And I don't think the 60,000 figure that is put out
Yeah.
by the Hamas Ministry of Health is remotely near, because they are only counting the bodies they have found. What
Yeah.
about all the ones that have not been found? And some people are putting the death toll to many multiples of
Yeah.
this number. So I would say, so it is, of course, extremely sad, outrageous, and quite frankly, I don't know, disheartening to an extreme that it should require this. But yes, totally. How can the West claim to love, well, to have any values? Forget freedom and democracy, any values at all, any human values at all. It cannot possibly have any human values. And of course, this whole, we had fascism where we already saw a lot of bad things. But as many critics pointed out, I think it was Mrs. who pointed out that what was shocking about fascism is that they brought the techniques that were used in the colonial situations to Europe. There's concentration camps existing in Namibia, for example, and people were massacred elsewhere. But now this was happening in Europe. So,
Yeah.
so the imperial history of the West is absolutely littered with abominable instances of their inhumanity. That's fine. But yes, I think that the world is waking up to this. As we started this in the early part of this interview, we already we discussed how capitalism is not about democracy.
Yeah.
And it is about freedom only in the sense that it concerns the freedoms of property. It's not about any other kind of freedom. Look at the way just yesterday there were these enormous demonstrations in London, which claims to be the most liberal of all powers. And nearly 500 people were arrested for supporting an organization that the government has willfully banned for the simple crime of standing up for Palestinian rights. I mean, this is where we are at. I mean, in what sense can you be said to love even freedom, let alone democracy? So the West capitalism is not naturally democratic. The whole problem of democracy for capitalism is, how do you justify a system which is about preserving the power and privileges of a tiny elite in the context of mass enfranchisement? And you manage this, you have basically managed this by essentially having, the best democracy that money can buy, which in this case is, of course, corporate money. What can corporate money afford? So I would say that Gaza has definitely led to that. And I would say also that there are elements of the crumbling of the imperial system here too, because essentially what you have is a problematic relationship between the sort of ringmaster and the circus animal, so to speak, the ringmaster being the United States, the circus animal being Israel. Israel was supposed to be the instrument, the cat's paw of the United States in the Middle East. But there are so many things that have gone wrong within Israel that today Netanyahu, as a leader, must keep the war going for his own reasons, whether or not it suits the United States to keep it going. Trump was allegedly, I'm told, that he yelled at Netanyahu, saying that, my people are telling me that there is genocide going on and that this will not be tolerated by people in the United States. And I have no doubt that ordinary people in the United States are looking at the scenes that are televised every night from Gaza and saying this is not who we are supposed to be about. There are, people of every color and creed who will be against it. The requirements of imperialism are now such that in order for the requirements to be fulfilled, imperialism has to stand nakedly as a tremendously oppressive, even murderous force before the rest of the world. And when that point comes, it's not possible to maintain the system. No system of oppression ever says, I want to oppress you. The worst patriarch doesn't say to a woman that, you must work all day and, just bear children and not be educated and stay in the kitchen barefoot and pregnant and whatever. They will never say that. They will say, my dear, it is very good for you. It is in keeping with your nature that you should have children and love them. It will fulfill your nature, etc. But these lies are no longer working because the atrocities visited upon the victim are now so obvious that soothing rhetoric has no place. Nobody will listen to it.
What we're on now, I think, with the moral question, my background really is moral philosophy, so I hear what you said loud and clear. I'm trying to tie it to the geopolitical analysis that you give. I guess so here's another way to put it. I interviewed Ilan Pappé at the beginning of this whole situation after October 7th. He's a great, Israeli historian. And we were talking about the possibility of a liberated Palestine. And I don't think I quite understood it at the time because I was still learning a lot of this stuff that you've put on the table now. He kind of said, he's like, I don't know if we need to wait for the end of capitalism to liberate Palestine. And I didn't even really comprehend that was an argument some people were making. So I'll put it on your table, and maybe since your analysis is more economic, in what ways is what we're seeing in Gaza, maybe what we're seeing in Iran, maybe Sudan, how are these capitalist wars, or how are they almost necessitated? Like, you're calling them basically like unavoidable results when you start with a system that has these built-in contradictions, right? Can you try, because I think it's pretty foreign for some people to think like, oh, isn't it just like a religious war and of course there's all the other rhetoric and the truth, and I grew up in a Zionist family, and you hear a million other mythologies that lay on top of this. But I think you would say at heart, and maybe this is your analysis of a lot of things, which I appreciate, at heart, this is capitalism leading us down a path that it was always going to. So how is the assault, the genocide, whatever we call it, in Gaza, a capitalist war? Yeah.
Okay. Here's the thing. You're totally right. So, remember I said earlier that capitalism requires a cocoon to exist within. And that cocoon must do two sets of things that are mutually contradictory. On the one hand, accept its excess commodities and capital, and on the other hand, yield up, surrender, practically.
I love that. Can I just make sure I understand it? So it requires a source, which is human. It's always human, to be subjugated to a significant degree, but not too much that they can't afford.
No.
Okay.
This is contradictory. So ideally, yes, there should be some kind of balance, as you are speaking of. So, but on the one hand, if the subordinated periphery is to accept excess commodities and capital, it must be prosperous and stable enough to do so.
Right.
On the other hand, if it is to yield up or surrender inputs and labor that are very cheap, it must be very impoverished.
Right.
So this is what it needs. Now, in the early period of imperialism, when, first of all, Britain created its empire, and of course the French had their empire, which was then made smaller by Britain, etc. And then, of course, the Germans came along, and the Japanese. The Americans are actually a very peculiar type of empire, because America has grown through what's called internal colonialism, what its historians call internal colonialism. So you took away the land of the indigenous peoples, and then you sort of populated it with slave labor and all of that. And so in a certain sense, I always feel that the United States, historically, US governments have never cared about a goodly section of their population, in a way which is very different from most other countries. I mean, even when you are a capitalist country, there is some element of social cohesion, which is kind of totally lacking in the US. But that's another matter altogether. But the US is also an empire, and, it has had, and it wanted to be an even bigger empire, and it sought to exercise informal colonialism over the Western Hemisphere under the guise of the Monroe Doctrine and so on. So the world is now divided up by the early 20th century. Now, in this process, you see, what happens typically is that Western countries would colonize a place and then flood it with their cheap commodities. What do cheap commodities do? They deindustrialize that country. Whatever handicrafts, whatever manufacturing production that was going on would be wiped out and replaced by the cheap imports. Now, once you've done that and you've impoverished a country, it can no longer serve as markets.
Right. You can't sell them stuff.
As sites for investment of capital. It is why, on the whole, foreign direct investment is quite limited. Because in a certain sense, the operation of imperialism itself has made it very difficult to treat these countries as either markets or as outlets for excess capital. And this creates, so capital creates problems for itself, makes it harder to fulfill its own needs by its own actions. This is why we call it a contradictory system. It's a bit like a child breaking the toy that he wants to play with. He's not a very well-behaved child, and instead of enjoying a toy as it should be enjoyed, it breaks it. Anyways, metaphors all have limitations, but that's what. Okay, so then what has happened? And of course, remember that there was already a crisis of demand, which was lay at the bottom of the Great Depression, which was after the period that I'm talking about. By 1914, this process of the impoverishment of the rest of the world was complete. They were no longer going to serve as these sorts of markets and outlets. The Great Depression was already a sign of that. It was a demand-related issue. In the Golden Age, demand expanded because of welfare states in first world countries, socialism in the second world, and development, attempts at autonomous national development in the third world. So markets expanded, but capitalist production expanded even more. And of course, it had less territory, less space to expand in because there was already communism. So markets were saturated by the 70s. Since that time, the policies chosen by the governments of the imperialist countries have been neoliberal policies. Neoliberal policies do not solve the problem of demand. They exacerbate the problem of demand. They do not allow the market to expand. So the competition for a limited market becomes even more intensive. Okay. So, So essentially, we are also seeing a situation in which, so first of all, of the two sets of needs, one set of needs was already not being fulfilled, and now will be even less fulfilled if we continue along the capitalist way. And then, therefore, to come back to your point, in what way are these wars of imperialism? They are wars of imperialism because they are primarily about resources. Can the Americans control the Middle East and therefore through that control the rest of the world vis-a-vis the rest of the world's reliance on oil in particular? And the role of Israel there, at least since the 60s onwards, has been to be an agent of the United States. But the problems of imperialism have now intensified considerably. On the one hand, you have Iran and Saudi Arabia making peace with one another under Chinese auspices. So again, a very different system is a player in the game as it was back in the post-Second World War period, the height of the Cold War. Secondly, the Israeli government is going out of control. Who can control them? God knows. And they're going out of control, not because, they have suddenly acquired some sudden wealth and autonomy. On the contrary, they are getting more desperate. So God only knows what they will do. So everything is kind of, the contradictions are piling on top of one another and complicating one another. That's, but nevertheless, at the end of the day, that's what the wars are about. As I said in the beginning of this, value cannot exist without money.
Yeah.
And it is very critical for money to retain its value vis-a-vis commodities. But the moment you have development in the rest of the world, which increases the prices of primary commodities, which are not elastic in supply. I mean, normally for most manufactured commodities, if the price goes up, price of pencils go up, pencil manufacturers will supply more pencils and the price will come down again. So it will be a temporary episode. But with primary commodities, which are the things we extract from the earth, in the case of mining commodities, it requires years of investment to bring things on stream. In the case of agricultural activities, again, it requires years of investment to open new agricultural land, but also agricultural production is seasonal, so there will be no supply response in the immediate. So these things mean that the more the rest of the world develops, the less it will be possible for the value of money to be maintained in the Western world.
Yeah.
The value of metropolitan money will not be maintained. And when you have that situation, that is endangering the very, how can you say, the lifeblood of capitalism?
Yeah.
Because money is the circulation system of capitalism. So, that's another really important and interesting aspect. So, what the implication of that is not just that you fight for resources, you also must prevent development in those
Yeah.
countries.
Well, let's end it there for now. But this was great. This is a lot. I'm gonna have to rewatch and piece it together. But that was really fun.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it as well.
Okay, just a couple notes at the end, my afterthoughts on the conversation with Radhika Desai. Really interesting, a ton there to go through and research more, I think. One of the things was she mentioned a book by Arno Meyer, which I put on the screen. He also apparently wrote another book called From Israel to Zionism, or it was called From Plowshares into Swords, about Israel and Zionism. And apparently was quite critical of Zionism and Israel and was predicting exactly what would happen. I haven't read the book. If any of you have, you can let me know if it's good, but sounds, just wanted to mention that. And then as far as next guests I have lined up, I do wish there was a little bit more talk on BRICS in particular with Radhika, but my next guest, Patrick Bond, should handle my curiosity on that question in particular. And then after Patrick Bond is Coleman Hughes, which some of you may know was my former co-host on this show. We both, when we lived in New York, we started the show together and we became friends. We don't live in the same place anymore. We don't talk almost at all anymore. And I think it's probably obvious we have radically different views and philosophical sort of comprehensions of what's happening in Israel and many other places. So that's going to be an interesting conversation. If people are really interested, I have a massive archive, which you could find on whatjthinks.com when it was audio only. And Coleman and I are on that in that stuff, talking about a lot of things. If anyone wants to dive into the archive, it's pretty organized on whatjthinks.com. So if you made it this far, you're probably a fan. Go ahead and like and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. I also want to mention I have a little Easter egg that I drop in all of the episodes with the record that I put on the display behind me that has a vague connection to the conversation or the episode that I'm talking about. I'm a dork, but I'm having fun even while the world burns. Anyway, like, subscribe, share, comment, all of that. Try to figure this thing out, and I'll see you soon.